What shall we do with the drunken sailor? Drag him along the keel till he's over. Keelhauling, one of the most brutal forms of punishment in naval history. Who hasn't heard of it? Keelhauling is a form of physical punishment which was used on pirate ships and in several navies such as the English, Dutch and French navy from the 17th to the 19th century. Because keelhauling was usually performed publicly, it had an exemplarily character on board of these ships. It was used rarely and only in cases of violence against comrades or civilians, or in cases of mutiny. Among the different practices of keelhauling, the worst was to drag the victims along the ship's keel. The keel is a structural element of the ship which runs along the central line of the boat and resembles a ridge. The meaning of keelhauling, derived from the Dutch keelhalen, is precisely to drag along the keel. William Falconer's Dictionary of the Marine states, for example, quote, "This sentence is executed with a serenity of temper peculiar to the Dutch. The culprit is allowed sufficient intervals to recover the sense of pain, of which indeed he is frequently deprived during the operation." End quote. First, keelhauling was taken up in the late Middle Ages by the Dutch Navy, from whence it spread to other European navies. A Dutch keelhauling manual, written in 1537, states, quote, that sailors who were caught drunk continuously on guard, who were in fights on board or pulled a knife against their comrades, should be keelhauled, end quote. Yet the Dutch, who invented the word for this punishment, did not invent the punishment itself. The earliest evidence for keelhauling actually dates back to ancient Greece. In about 800 BC, the Lex Rhodia, a set of maritime laws from the island of Rhodes, mentions the keelhauling technique as a form of punishment for pirates. An Athenian vase, dated to the 4th or 5th century BC, shows the first depiction of this punishment. On the vase, the pictures imply that the victim was thrown overboard, pushed down with a stick, and then dragged on board on the other end of the ship. The precise form of the punishment could vary strongly. The mildest form was to attach the condemned to a rope, pull him up to the yard and let him fall into the water. This process could be repeated several times, depending on the verdict. Sometimes a weight was attached to the feet of the punished to make him sink and stay underwater for a while. This would have produced a sensation of drowning in the victim, similar to the modern-day waterboarding. Another variant was the so-called dry keelhauling. This basically worked the same way as the conventional keelhauling, except the rope was cut short so that the fall ended above the waterline. The condemned stopped falling abruptly, which would dislocate the victim's shoulders. After his punishment, the keelhauled was usually dismissed from the navy. Finally, in the most well-known form of keelhauling, the condemned was dragged under the ship along the keel, or more frequently from starboard to larboard. A good example of how this could have looked like is Black Sails, so spoiler warning. A rope was placed under the ship. The sailor was attached to one end and thrown into the water. A part of the crew then started to pull on the other end of the rope in order to drag the man under the keel of the ship towards them. Even though it was rare that the keelhauled drowned, it was very likely that the barnacles on the hull would cut his body open, leaving him with terrible and often deadly wounds. This is what happens to Captain Teach, better known as Blackbeard in Black Sails. In some cases, the keelhauling was performed multiple times until the punished died. Particularly spectacular was the form of keelhauling practiced by the Dutch Navy. It combined two methods: first, to let the sailor fall from the yard, and secondly, to drag him under the keel. Then he was pulled up on the other side of the ship with his head downwards. To prevent premature drowning, sometimes an oil-soaked piece of clothing was wrapped around the head of the punished. To avoid fatal cuts on his body, a weight was attached to him. This way he survived and could receive additional strikes with a 9-tailed cat or ropes. Until the reputation of keelhauling declined in the 18th century, it had been practiced continually. In 1704, the French Navy was the first to prescribe it, though it was only officially abolished in 1848. The Royal Navy abolished it in 1730, and the Swedish Navy in 1755. In the Netherlands, keelhauling was forbidden for some time around the 1800s, but reintroduced in 1815. Only in 1854 was it officially abolished. However, the ban only pertained to the form of keelhauling which consists of dragging the punished under the ship. Letting the victim fall from the yard was still legally practiced. The two most recent cases of keelhauling took place in France in 1837 and in Egypt in 1882. Thanks to a correspondent of the British journal The Morning Advertiser, we possess a detailed description of the events. He describes one of the condemned sailors like this, quote, "His face was turned towards us. was. It was bleeding and torn, his clothes hanging in shreds, and his hands were dripping with blood. His eyes were open, but they were filled with blood." End quote. The keelhauling took about 24 seconds, the journalist reported, but the victims were not dead and were dragged along the keel one more time. Quote, "The first frightful journey had terminated by their being scratched and torn. At the end of the second, they were mutilated." End quote. The report concludes with the remark that, quote, "It may be hoped they were dead. Death must have been a welcome release."